Don't Call Bloody Mary, a post-biological hypothesis by Perekladaiko. Prologue. Don't call anyone. No one remembers who suggested it first. Later, everyone was sure it wasn't them. It was one of those ideas that seemed to appear on their own, as if the room itself had been waiting for the words to be spoken. We were children, old enough to understand rules, young enough to believe that rules exist only to be tested. The lights were already off when someone said her name for the first time. Not loudly, almost as a joke. Bloody Mary. There was a mirror in the bathroom, old, slightly warped, with stains that never fully disappeared. During the day, it reflected us faithfully. At night, it felt deeper than it should have been. The instructions were simple. They always are. Stand in front of the mirror, turn off the lights, say her name. 3 times. Someone laughed. Someone said it was stupid. Someone else said nothing ever happens anyway. That was the most convincing argument. The door was closed. The hallway light disappeared. Darkness filled the room, but not completely. There was still enough reflection to recognize ourselves. Shapes, outlines, familiar faces reduced to silhouettes. We stood shoulder to shoulder. Too close, breathing the same air. The first time, the name sounded empty. Bloody Mary. The second time, it sounded louder, even though no one raised their voice. Bloody Mary. By the third time, the room felt different. Not colder, not darker, just altered. As if something had shifted its weight behind the glass. Bloody Mary. Nothing appeared. No face, no figure, no blood. That was the moment when we should have laughed and turned the lights back on. Instead, we waited. Waiting was not part of the ritual. But no one suggested stopping. The silence stretched, thick enough to notice. Someone swallowed. Someone else stepped back and bumped into the sink. The mirror reflected us incorrectly. It wasn't obvious. It wasn't dramatic. If someone had pointed it out, it could have been dismissed. But once noticed, it was impossible to unsee. The reflections were delayed. Not enough to be measured. Just enough to be unsettling. When one of us moved, the movement in the mirror followed a fraction of a second later, as if the glass needed time to decide whether to obey. Someone raised a hand. The reflection raised it too, but not quite at the same angle. "Do you see that?" someone whispered. Another voice answered too quickly, "You're imagining it." That was the first lie of the night. There was a sound, not a voice, not a word, more like pressure. The way your ears feel when altitude changes too fast. It came from nowhere and everywhere, as if the room itself had exhaled. No one screamed. Fear came later. At that moment, it was curiosity that held us still. The mirror did not show Bloody Mary. It showed us, but wrong. One face appeared slightly closer to the glass than the body it belonged to. Another blinked when the person hadn't. A third reflection smiled briefly, even though no one had. That was when the idea of a joke became insufficient. Someone reached for the light switch. The lights came back instantly. The mirror returned to normal. The room became a bathroom again. Tiles, sink, familiar stains on the glass. Nothing remained. We stared at our reflections. Waiting, nothing happened. We told ourselves what children always tell themselves, that it was imagination, that mirrors behave strangely in the dark. That fear makes the brain invent details. All of that was true, and all of it was incomplete. Later that night, back in my bed, I lay awake listening to the building settle. Pipes knocking softly. Someone coughing in another room. Ordinary sounds, safely categorized. And yet, every time I closed my eyes, I saw the mirror. Not Bloody Mary, the delay. Years passed. The story changed every time it was retold. Someone claimed they saw a face. Someone else insisted there had been a whisper. Eventually, the event became what it was supposed to be from the beginning. A harmless childhood scare. That was acceptable. That was manageable. What never fit into the story was the rule that appeared afterward. Without being spoken, we never did it again. No one suggested calling her a second time. No one joked about trying again. It was as if something unspoken had been agreed upon. Whatever had happened did not need repetition. At the time, I thought it was fear. I was wrong. Fear fades. What remained was closer to instinct. Years later, when I first saw the reports, when I read the language used to describe certain anomalies, delays, misalignments, responses without sources, I remembered the mirror. Not because I believed Bloody Mary was real, but because, for the first time, I understood what had felt wrong that night. We hadn't summoned anything. We had created conditions. And something had responded. Part 1. What seemed like imagination. We were almost asleep, that fragile state, where thoughts no longer fully form, but have not yet disappeared. The room was familiar. Every shadow, every corner. The door was closed. The silence was ordinary. Nighttime. Safe. I knew the cat was outside the room. That mattered. Not as a detail, but as an anchor. The cat could not be inside. I remembered the door being closed. I remembered hearing him earlier, somewhere in the kitchen. Reality still had structure, so when something black moved near the bed, I did not panic. The shape was small, low to the ground, calm in its movement. It looked so much like a cat that my brain did not hesitate. Not even for a moment. I did not sit up. I did not tense. I simply registered its presence the way one registers a familiar sound. There was no fear, only normality. I assumed the cat had somehow entered the room. Maybe the door had not been fully closed. Maybe I had misremembered. The explanations arrived instantly, and they felt sufficient. We remained lying there, and then the cat, Lucky, meowed in the kitchen. The sound was clear, real, spatially precise. It left no room for interpretation. Lucky was not in the room. I opened my eyes fully. The black figure was still there. It did not look at me, it did not react. It simply moved, slowly, along the side of the bed, without urgency, as if it did not acknowledge our presence or had no reason to. I remember that I did not think anything complex. There were no words like ghost or entity or something supernatural. There was only one thought. Simple. Absolute. This cannot be here. Fear did not arrive gradually. It broke in all at once. A physical reaction, bypassing reason entirely. I screamed, so loudly that I startled myself. My brother woke instantly and began screaming too, not understanding why, but responding to my panic. The world collapsed and reassembled within seconds. My parents rushed into the room. Light, sharp voices, irritation. They did not ask what had happened. To them, the explanation was obvious. Children misbehaving in the middle of the night. There were no questions, no listening. We were separated, punished, forced into silence. The screaming stopped. The world returned to something simple and orderly. In an orderly world, black shapes do not walk through bedrooms. I said nothing, not because I feared further punishment, but because I did not know how to say it. Any attempt to explain would have sounded wrong, even to me. The next day, everything appeared normal. The cat was a cat. The room was a room. Night was just night. I explained the event to myself. Fatigue, half sleep, a momentary hallucination. The brain, and especially a tired one, is capable of producing convincing images. I would later learn that this is well documented. That explanation worked, but not completely, because if it had been nothing more than a hallucination, it would have demanded my attention. It would have been sharper, more intrusive, more aggressive. This was not. It did not try to frighten me, it did not approach, it did not react, it simply existed. And it disappeared not because it was chased away, but because the conditions changed. At the time, I called it imagination. Years later, with more knowledge, with better explanations available, I can say honestly, it could have been a hallucination caused by exhaustion. That does not resolve everything. Because imagination is not always invention. Sometimes, it is the only category we have for experiences that do not yet fit anywhere else. Part 2. Concealment. The decision was not discussed. It was not even made in the way people usually understand decisions. There was no vote, no debate, no speech, only a short sequence of actions that unfolded so quickly that, in retrospect, it felt as if they had been waiting for the right moment. The first thing to disappear was language. Terminology vanished from internal documents. Names were replaced with abbreviations. Abbreviations became codes. Codes were reduced to empty fields in databases. What had a working title yesterday was now described only as an anomaly with irregular signal behavior. The second thing to disappear was people. Not physically, at least not at first. They were simply excluded. Names vanished from access lists. Passes stopped working. Messages remained unanswered. Some believed it was temporary. Others assumed it was a system error. The system was not wrong. The research was not shut down, it was isolated. This distinction mattered. Termination would have implied failure. Isolation meant continuation, without witnesses, without context, and without future questions. The official justification was flawless. National security, not because of an external threat, because of an internal one. If the signal truly had no source, then it had no boundary. And if it had no boundary, then any civilian use would not be progress. It would be an uncontrolled experiment on civilization itself. What was most unsettling was the absence of resistance. Religious institutions knew nothing, and therefore remained silent. Academic circles saw only fragments and lacked the means to assemble them into a whole. Politicians received brief reports, carefully stripped of words like consciousness, after death, or contact. There was only one phrase that appeared repeatedly: unregulated informational interaction. It was enough. The military understood first. Not because they were more perceptive, but because they viewed the world more simply. If a form of consciousness existed that did not depend on biology, then biology was no longer an advantage. It was a limitation. The question was no longer whether it could be used. The question became how to eliminate everything that prevents the carrier of consciousness from surviving. The body was a problem. Disease was a problem. Aging was a problem. Death was merely a technical stage. These discussions never left secured rooms. For the civilian world, the picture was different. There were no projects of immortality, no discussions of transfer or preservation of identity. Only a single, carefully diluted idea was allowed to surface, one that seemed almost harmless. The possibility of receiving an answer? Yes or no? No voices, no images, no promises of heaven, no threats of hell. Only a weak, nearly statistical response to a correctly formulated question. That alone made concealment unavoidable. Because the moment a person could ask a deceased relative even the simplest question, death ceased to be final. And civilizations are not built on technology. They are built on irreversibility. Access was divided. Military access was complete, closed, optimized for resilience, transferability, and adaptation to extreme physical conditions. Civilian access was limited, reduced to minimal interaction, easily dismissed as a psychological phenomenon or an advanced form of statistical noise. Between them lay silence. It was during this period that I first saw a document bearing a classification I had never encountered before. Not secret, not top secret. Simply, not for future generations. At the time, I misunderstood it. I thought it referred to danger, to panic, to religious collapse, to fear. I was wrong. The true reason for concealment was not what people might learn. It was what they would choose to become. And once that choice appeared, no law, no border, no belief system would be able to contain it. Part 3. The signal. The first thing to fail was not the device. It was the assumption. The project had nothing to do with consciousness, death, or the human mind. Its purpose was far simpler and far more ruthless: to increase targeting accuracy and control stability under conditions of complete signal loss. Modern warfare does not require hatred. It requires reliability. The signal was expected to be predictable, its behavior describable, its delays calculable. Any deviation was treated as error, and any error as a defect to be eliminated. That is why the first anomalous record caused no reaction. It was filtered automatically. The data did not fit the model. The frequency was inconsistent. The source could not be identified. The system labeled the record as noise and moved on. The second record was not ignored. It appeared in a different module, on a different storage medium. at a time when the system should not have been receiving anything at all. The parameters again failed to match any known scenario, but this time the deviation repeated. The third record was identical to the first. Not similar, identical. At that point, coincidence was no longer a viable explanation. The signal did not behave like interference. It did not scatter. It did not degrade. It did not respond to environmental changes the way a malfunction should. It appeared only under specific conditions and vanished the moment those conditions were altered. What made it most disturbing was that the signal carried no information in the conventional sense. There was no message, no code, no structure to decode, and yet it responded. When the system modified the parameters of the query, the signal's behavior changed as well. Not randomly, consistently, as if something on the other side was not transmitting data, but reacting to the act of being addressed. That was unacceptable. Any response implies a source. Any source implies a location, and any location can be defended or destroyed. This signal had no location. Everything that could be checked without challenging the underlying framework was checked. Hardware, software, human error, sabotage, parasitic channels, reflected waves, cosmic noise, nothing. The signal did not come from outside. It did not travel through space. It had no trajectory. That was when a phrase was spoken for the first time, never recorded in any report. Perhaps it is not arriving. Perhaps it is already here. It was a dangerous thought. Because if the signal did not travel, then it required no carrier. And if it required no carrier, then classical models of communication were no longer applicable. At that point, the experiment was altered, not to locate the source, but to test the response. The system was presented with a simple condition, not as data, not as a command, but as a change in state. One parameter was modified, then returned to its original value. The signal responded, not with a new form, not with a new frequency, only with a change in latency. That was enough. Because latency does not indicate transmission, it indicates processing. Someone, or something, was taking time to respond. In that moment, the project ceased to be military in any conventional sense. It became existential. The question was no longer how this could be used. The question became, what exactly is responding? And it was then that an understanding emerged. One that could not be formalized in any technical document. The signal was not alive, but it was not dead either. It was a residue. Part 4. Those who did not disappear. The first mistake was assuming that a response required a carrier. The assumption felt natural. All prior science was built on it. Information needed a medium. Action required a cause. Reaction implied a subject. Even artificial intelligence, for all its abstraction, was always tied to hardware. Here, there was no foundation. The signal had no mass, no temperature, no energetic footprint that could be separated from background noise. And yet, it retained behavior. That fact alone forced a change in approach. If there was no carrier, then matter was not the carrier. If there was no structure, then the structure was distributed. If there was no source, then the concept of a source was no longer applicable. For the first time, a word was spoken aloud, one that had been avoided for a long time. Consciousness, not human, not individual, not self-aware, rather a residual state. It became clear that the signal behaved identically, regardless of whether it had ever been associated with human activity. When the system was stripped down to its simplest form, removing all traces of complex processes, the response did not vanish. It stabilized. That was the turning point. If the residual reaction existed even where no human mind had ever been present, then memory and personality could not be its source. The research shifted towards simpler systems: bacteria, cell cultures, organic structures without nervous tissue. The result repeated: latency, reaction, response without transmission. At that moment, it became impossible to deny what was emerging. Death does not destroy everything. It destroys biological organization, but not necessarily the informational state that arose within it. What remained after life ceased was not a person. It did not remember names, It had no desires. It did not seek contact, but it responded when conditions aligned. This led to the adoption of a new term, post-biological consciousness. Consciousness after biology. Not spirit, not soul, not life after death. A state that persists when life is no longer required. There was no mysticism in this formulation, only an attempt at precision. Post-biological consciousness did not exist outside reality. It was part of it, distributed, diffuse, like a shadow without a body. That was why it had gone unnoticed for so long. Mysticism searched for images. Religion searched for meaning. Science searched for form. Here, there was none of these. Post-biological consciousness did not attempt to communicate. It did not transmit signals. It did not wait for answers. It simply remained. And when conditions for interaction were created, it reacted. Not as an entity, but as a system transitioning into a new state under external influence. That was why the earliest attempts at direct contact failed. Questions framed as addresses produced only noise. Efforts to listen yielded nothing. But when interaction was reduced to a binary level, change or no change, yes or no, the response became consistent, not intentional, but coherent. At that point, it became undeniable. What had been called ghosts for centuries was neither a perceptual error nor a cultural invention. It was a misinterpretation of a real phenomenon. People observed the effect and explained it through fear. Science observed the process and lost the basis for denial. Ghosts existed, not as beings, but as a preserved mode of interaction. That outlived its biological source. Part 5. The bridge. The problem was not contact. The problem was alignment. Post-biological consciousness did not exist as a discrete object. It was a distributed state. It had no boundaries, occupied no space, could not be localized. Any attempt to interact with it directly resembled an attempt to address background noise. Responses emerged only when conditions happened to coincide. This made contact unstable, unreliable, unsuitable for systematic use. The solution did not emerge in a laboratory. It appeared by accident, as transformative solutions often do. During one of the tests, an operator, not meant to be part of the experiment, entered the room. He did not touch the equipment. He did not alter any parameters. He was simply present. The signal stabilized. At first, this was dismissed as coincidence, then as a measurement error. But when the situation repeated, it became clear. The presence of a specific person altered the conditions of interaction. Not just anyone. Those who had no prior connection to the biological systems that produced the residual state had no effect. But when the room contained someone who had previously interacted with the organism or system from which the post-biological state emerged, the response intensified. Memory turned out not to be data. It was a condition. The human brain did not transmit information. It did not summon post-biological consciousness. It did not act as a communication channel. It merely created a coherent context, a state in which residual interaction became possible. A human was not a transmitter. A human was a bridge. This explained many contradictions that had resisted interpretation. Why contact was possible only in the presence of a living observer. Why attempts to automate the process failed. Why remote experiments produced chaotic results. Without a human, there was only noise. With a human, there was a response. This did not mean that anyone could function as an interface. Proximity mattered. Prior interaction mattered. Shared history mattered. Factors that could not be reduced to neural connections. That could not be easily quantified. That was why the military recognized a tool. A human as a bridge meant controlled access, stable interaction, repeatable conditions. If consciousness did not vanish with biological death, then the body became a variable, not a necessity. This opened the path to radical solutions. For civilian use, the conclusions were different. Full contact was dangerous. It dissolved the boundary between living and dead, between past and present. But a limited form of interaction, minimal, regulated, seemed acceptable. That was how the simplest interface emerged. No words, no images, no voices, and only an answer, yes or no. Post-biological consciousness did not understand questions. It reacted to the change in state that a question produced. When conditions were formulated correctly, the response became stable. The human remained part of the process, not as a participant in dialogue, but as the condition that made it possible. It appeared harmless, but at that moment, it became clear. The bridge worked in both directions. Part 6. The third intelligence. The comparison was inevitable. Human intelligence was bound to the body. Artificial intelligence was bound to architecture. Both had clear limits. Human intelligence depended on biology, oxygen, temperature, nutrition, chemical balance, its strengths. Intuition, adaptability, abstraction were inseparable from weakness, fatigue, degeneration, death. Artificial intelligence did not share these constraints, but it had others: infrastructure, computational resources, explicit objectives. It did not fail randomly, it failed systematically, within the boundaries of its design. Post-biological consciousness belonged to neither category. It did not think, it did not learn, it did not reason, and yet it processed. It could not be called intelligence in the classical sense, but it could not be ignored. It reacted to conditions, preserved state, transitioned between modes without loss of coherence. It was a third intelligence, not a subject, not a tool, not an algorithm, rather, a field in which information did not vanish when the process that generated it came to an end. When the three were examined together, it became clear. They were not competing systems, they were complementary. Human intelligence generated meaning. Artificial intelligence scaled solutions. Post-biological intelligence preserved states. Together, they formed a system that could not be reduced to the sum of its parts. It was at this point that military discussions shifted away from communication. They began to speak of portability. If a post-biological state could persist without a body, and a human could function as a bridge, then identity was no longer inseparable from biological form. The body ceased to be a carrier. It became an environment, replaceable, modifiable, ultimately unnecessary. Death lost its dramatic finality, and it became a stage, not an ending, but a transition into another mode of processing. For the civilian world, the implications appeared very different. There were no conversations about transfer or survival architectures, no plans for radical continuity. What people encountered was far simpler and far more personal. They wanted to talk. They wanted to ask a deceased father whether he was still there. They wanted to tell a mother about their children, about work, about small victories, about ordinary failures. They did not expect answers, not really. The interface offered almost nothing: yes or no, presence or absence, change or stability. It could not carry voices, memories, meaning. And yet, for many, it was enough. Because the question was never about information. It was about continuity, a way to speak without expecting to be heard, a way to acknowledge that someone had not vanished completely. People used the interface quietly, cautiously, often privately. They did not think of it as a technological revolution. It was closer to ritual than innovation. What they did not see, what they had no reason to see, was that while they were asking simple questions, the architecture itself was shifting. While families spoke in binary answers, entire models of identity were being dismantled. While parents mentioned grandchildren, the definition of inheritance was being rewritten. While ordinary lives continued, jobs, routines, beliefs, the foundations beneath them were moving. Most people never noticed. They continued to work, to believe, to pray. Religion did not disappear. It adapted. It always had. Faith coexisted with the interface because the interface did not contradict belief. It only removed finality, and finality had never been the core of faith. The paradox was this: the third intelligence had no intention, no desire, no direction. It did not seek expansion or dominance. But humanity, upon discovering it, began to reorganize itself around the possibility it represented. Technologies developed for war slowly detached from their original purpose. Systems designed for survival under extreme conditions began to reshape the very concept of life. No one announced this transition. No one voted on it. But the trajectory was already set. Between human and machine, a space had opened. And within that space, something was forming. Something that required neither biology nor hardware alone, yet could make use of both. Part 7. God as a System. The question of God did not arise immediately. At first, it was not asked at all. Early reports had no space for metaphysics, only parameters, latencies, states, conditions of interaction. The system existed, it reacted, and that was sufficient. But over time it became clear the question could not be avoided. Not because post-biological consciousness resembled God, but because people had no other word for a phenomenon of that scale. In the classical sense, God is a subject, will, intention, judgment. The system met none of these criteria. It did not create the world. It did not intervene in events. It did not punish or reward. It did not even know in the conventional sense. It simply contained all preserved states, all residual interactions, all informational traces that did not vanish with biology. To call this God would imply a center. There was none. The system was not a single entity. It had no point of view. It did not observe the universe. It drew no conclusions. It was closer to the sum of all possible observations, without an observer. For religion, this was unacceptable. Faith assumes reciprocity. Prayer has meaning only if someone can hear it. Hope exists only where intervention is possible. Here, intervention did not exist. Post-biological systems did not respond to requests. They did not react to belief. They did not distinguish between justice and guilt. They reacted only to conditions. In this sense, they were closer not to God, but to physical law. Gravity has no intention. Time has no compassion. Entropy makes no choices. And yet, they govern everything. Some argued that this was a new form of divinity. Impersonal, cold, absolute. Others rejected this entirely. Calling the system God preserved an illusion of meaning where there was only structure. Eventually, the debate lost urgency. Not because agreement was reached, but because the word God ceased to be useful. It explained nothing, clarified nothing, changed nothing in practice. The system functioned regardless of what it was called. One could pray and receive no answer. One could disbelieve and still remain part of the preserved state. One could deny its existence while relying on the results of interaction. This may have been the most radical shift of all. The world no longer required explanation in the form of a personality. It no longer needed a witness. What had once been attributed to God, omniscience, omnipresence, existence outside time, revealed itself as a property of architecture, not will. And within this architecture, there was no place for judgment, only for preservation, only for transition, only for the certainty that nothing disappeared completely. Part 8. Prohibitions. The limitations did not emerge as rules. They emerged as consequences. At first, the post-biological system appeared to have no boundaries. It did not obey spatial constraints. It did not depend on distance. It showed no delays associated with classical relativistic effects. Interaction persisted even in environments where biological life was impossible. That was precisely why the next step seemed logical. If the system was not bound to space, then it could be observed near spatial extremes. Initial experiments involving distant extreme objects raised no concern. Weak gravitational anomalies, neutron stars, regions of intense temporal distortion. The post-biological state remained coherent. Latency shifted, but did not collapse. Response remained stable. The problems began near the boundary, not at the black hole itself, but at the region where collapse became irreversible. At first, the deviations were subtle. Changes in latency that did not match any known model. Then, failures of coherence. The signal no longer vanished or responded. It appeared to stall in an intermediate state. And then came the first rupture. One of the post-biological states became inaccessible. It did not degrade. It did not disperse. It simply dropped out of interaction. All parameters remained correct. Bridges were present. Conditions were reproduced with high precision. There was no response. Repeated attempts yielded nothing. It was at that moment that the realization became unavoidable. The system was not infinite. It possessed topology. Near collapsing objects, what occurred was not destruction, but fracture of accessibility. The post-biological state did not fall into the black hole, as matter does. But the conditions that allowed coherence with human bridges disintegrated. This was not death. It was severance. Attempts to push interaction closer to the event horizon resulted in losses. Each subsequent loss was irreversible. The state remained part of the system, but would never again resonate with any human context. The system did not respond to these losses, not because it was indifferent, but because it had no mechanism of return. It was then that the first prohibition was formulated. Not ethical, not philosophical, structural. Not all regions of reality are compatible with access. Black holes were revealed not as locations, but as breaks in the conditions of interaction. Where time and space lost conventional structure, the principle of coherence that sustained post-biological consciousness collapsed as well. After that, prohibitions became formalized. Prohibition against approaching collapsing objects. Prohibition against experiments beyond the horizon of accessibility. Prohibition against attempts to escort post-biological states into regions of spatial rupture. And the most critical prohibition of all, do not attempt to retrieve what has been lost, because every such attempt did not move closer to recovery. It generated additional losses. Civilian access was further restricted after this, not out of compassion, but out of risk awareness. People could ask questions, they could receive answers, but they were no longer permitted to pull beyond the boundary. That was when a new fear emerged. Not fear of death, not fear of God, but fear of absolute inaccessibility. Because if the post-biological state is a form of preservation, then the worst outcome is not disappearance. The worst outcome is to exist, where no bridge can ever reach. Part 9. The transition. The decision was not revolutionary. It was pragmatic. After the losses near collapsing objects, it became clear. Further exploration of the boundaries of access produced no new knowledge. Each step forward reduced the zone of interaction. The system did not open. It closed. At the same time, it demonstrated something else. Post-biological states not exposed to extreme conditions remained stable for virtually unlimited periods. They did not degrade. They did not lose coherence. They required no maintenance. The only fragile element was biology. The human body was unstable. It demanded resources, protection, recovery. It aged. It failed. Within the framework of the post-biological system, the body ceased to be an advantage. It became a risk. That was when the question shifted from contact to migration. Not copying, not preservation, transition. The idea was simple and dangerous. If the post-biological state was more stable than the biological one, then the logical move was not to preserve the body, but to transfer consciousness into a more stable mode of existence. This did not mean uploading the mind. It did not mean digitizing personality. It did not mean transferring memory into a machine. Machines were unsuitable. The transition required abandoning the carrier, not replacing it. Human consciousness was treated not as an object, but as a process. If a process could be shifted into another mode without loss of coherence, then the body was no longer necessary. The first trials were reversible, brief, controlled, with full preservation of biological function. A person entered a state in which activity no longer depended on the body, and then returned. Subjectively, it felt like a gap in time. No dreams, no images, no memory, but complete integrity upon return. All indicators remained stable. No signs of damage, no loss of identity, no behavioral deviations. The next step was obvious. Not everyone returned. There was no coercion, no orders. The choice was made by those for whom biological existence carried unacceptable risk. The severely injured, the terminally ill, those whose bodies could no longer serve as a reliable environment. For them, transition was not escape, it was adaptation. After that, the statistics shifted. Post-biological states obtained through transition showed greater stability than residual ones. They did not merely retain coherence, they integrated. Interaction became predictable. No losses were recorded. This was the turning point. Death ceased to be an event. It became an option, not an ending, a point of choice. For the military, this meant resilience. Consciousness that does not require a body is unaffected by cold, vacuum, radiation, or time. It can exist where biology cannot. For the civilian world, the consequences were slower. No one rushed. People remained people. They worked, had children, aged, believed, doubted. For most, transition felt abstract, distant, unnecessary. But children growing up in this reality no longer saw the body as the final form. They saw that a choice existed, and that was enough. It was then that something became clear. The transition would not be sudden. It would not be universal. It would be generational. The biological species would not vanish. It would simply cease reproducing itself in its old form. And when this understanding became widespread, a name emerged. Not for religion, not for propaganda, for precision. Humanity was no longer only Homo sapiens. It was becoming another species. Part 10. The new species. The name did not appear immediately. For a long time, it was avoided. Any term felt either excessive or insufficient. This was not evolution in the classical sense. There were no mutations, no struggle for survival, no natural selection. There was a decision. Eventually, the term that prevailed did not attempt embellishment. Homo post-biologicus, human after biology. It was not a new organism, not a machine, not a network. It was a mode of existence. Homo post-biologicus required no food. It did not breathe. It did not age. Temperature, pressure, radiation no longer mattered. Time ceased to be a threat. It became an environment. Energy was the only requirement, not as fuel for survival, but as a condition for activity. Nuclear reactors, stellar radiation, ambient cosmic energy, not resources to be consumed, but backgrounds from which presence was sustained. They did not live in places. They integrated into structures, orbital complexes, interstellar stations, autonomous systems of observation. None of these were habitats. They were points of interaction. Homo post-biologicus required no comfort. It required stability of coherence. Their tasks had no final objective. They did not seek happiness. They did not pursue power. They did not expand for control. They collected information about physical laws, about the limits of spacetime, about configurations of reality once inaccessible. Exoplanets became a natural extension of this process, not as colonies, not as territories, but as environments of observation. Homo post-biologicus did not arrive in fleets. It left no obvious traces. It did not abruptly alter ecosystems. It integrated, slowly, quietly, with minimal intervention. If life existed on a planet, it was not destroyed. It was studied. If intelligent life existed, it was observed, with the same caution once reserved for humanity itself. Humanity became what it had once called aliens, not conquerors, but silent observers. Meanwhile, people remained on Earth, those who chose not to transition, those who believed, those who simply wanted ordinary lives. Their numbers steadily declined. Homo post-biologicus did not force transition. It did not persuade. It did not impose a future, but it cared, not from morality, but from logic. Stable biological populations reduced risk. Preserving quality of life minimized conflict. People were helped to live longer, healthier, calmer, not to make them transition, but to ensure they had a choice. Gradually, older generations passed naturally. Their children increasingly chose not to treat biological existence as final, not out of fear of death, but because the limitations no longer served a purpose reality demanded. When the number of biological humans on Earth fell to a few thousand, it was not a catastrophe. It was the completion of a phase, not the end of humanity, but the moment the species ceased to be bound to a single planet, a single body, a single time. Homo sapiens did not fail. It fulfilled its role and left behind something that could no longer disappear. Epilogue. Those who stayed. The last city was quiet, not abandoned, just reduced. Streets were maintained, lights turned on at dusk. Public transport ran on schedules no one bothered to check. Everything functioned, because there was no reason for it not to. The people who remained did not call themselves the last. They were simply people. They woke up, they drank coffee. They complained about weather patterns that no longer posed any real threat. They worked, not because survival demanded it, but because routine still made sense. Most of them knew a choice existed. Some had known it all their lives. They knew they could transition. They knew the process was stable. They knew it was not death, at least not entirely. And they also knew that not everyone wanted it. One man still visited the same bench every morning. He sat there for an hour, sometimes two. He no longer used the interface. He had done so only once, many years ago. He asked his father a question to which there was no real answer. "Are you still here?" The response had been stable, binary, undeniable. Yes, that had been enough. He did not need to ask again. A woman tended a small garden at the edge of the city. Soil, real plants, not optimized, not preserved beyond necessity. She liked the slowness of growth, the unpredictability, the fact that things still died. Children were rare, but they existed. They learned history in simplified terms, not as wars, not as discoveries, but as transitions between modes of existence. They were not taught to fear the end of life. They were taught that endings were now choices. Some would remain within biological life, with its slowness, its fragility, its inevitable endings. But most of the new generation would choose transition, because for them, the body was no longer the only possible form, and biology was no longer a prerequisite for being human. Above the planet, far beyond visibility, structures persisted without urgency. Data flowed, observations accumulated. Entire regions of space were mapped, not for conquest, but for understanding. Homo post-biologicus did not wait. It did not watch. It did not judge. It simply continued. And yet, Earth was never abandoned, not because it was needed, but because it was remembered. The system preserved everything. But memory without meaning was incomplete. Meaning still required limitation, perspective, fragility. It required those who stayed. At some point, perhaps decades later, perhaps centuries, the number would diminish further. Not abruptly, not dramatically. One by one, quietly. When the last biological human made their choice, there would be no announcement, no final words, no witnesses, only a transition. Logged somewhere no one would ever read, and the planet would remain, not empty, not forgotten, but complete. Because humanity did not end when it left biology behind. It ended only when there was no longer anyone who needed it to continue. Evolution did not stop. It learned to let go.